Hi, I'm Ben, I'm a volunteer here at Brooklands, and today we shall be talking about this beautiful 1926 Delage 15S8. Delage, in the early years of the automobile, right from 1904, were one of the key players in the French car industry. Louis Delage having a real knack for attention and detail, very similar to their arch rivals, Bugatti. And one of the ways that you generated publicity back in the 1920s was with Grand Prix racing, and Delage really hit the nail on the head with this design here. In 1926, this car was unveiled for the 26 Grand Prix season, which entailed new regulations, chief amongst which being a maximum engine displacement of 1.5 litres. So this car has a 1.5 litre straight 8 engine of unbelievable complexity. When it was first raced and when it actually won the first British Grand Prix held here at Brooklands, the car had innumerable flaws, chief amongst which being the exhaust pipe extending out of approximately where this fairing is here, along down the side of the car here, with the mandated Brooklands silencer right next to the pedal box, which caused severe burning for all drivers involved. We're talking probably in modern medical terminology, second or perhaps third degree burns to their feet. It was said by a fellow competitor, Henry Seagrave, it was said that when the Delage drivers dunked their feet in water, as was necessary to cool them down, the water hissed. I can certainly think of better places to be in a Grand Prix. Nevertheless, they did finish, and these cars were spectacularly reliable for their time. Only one of the cars at the British Grand Prix out of 3 entered wasn't able to finish, which obviously by modern standards is rather terrible. But back then was really rather impressive, and their driver was actually able to help out a fellow team member by finishing off their stint. In 1927, the cars were extensively modified. The chief visual appearance to differentiate 26 photo versus 27 is whether it has this aerodynamic nose cone on the front here. This is entirely for aerodynamics. The radiator itself is actually buried behind it, almost vertical, accessible underneath the bonnet. The brakes here are of a hydraulic type. Originally, they were fitted with cable brakes. The cable brakes actuated a drum about 35 centimetres in diameter. Enormous brakes to try and get the best amount of cooling possible in a day and age where brake fade was a very real concern, especially when racing. Later on, after these cars were sold by Delage, this was fitted with hydraulics, and they made them slightly larger, if a bit cruder. Originally, they were fitted with very intricate, delicate fins all over the drum to try and cool them down a little bit better. Suspension-wise, this car is really rather typical for the time. Leaf springs all round with friction-type shock absorbers. The leaf spring was very popular at this time, not only for its ease of manufacturing, but also because the friction between the individual leaves themselves helps out with dampening, which is, well, it eases strain on the shock absorbers themselves, which, being of a friction type, aren't exactly ideal by modern standards. Coming along down the near side, this was the chief modification, the reason why they've made so many changes to this car for 1927. They moved the whole engine over and swapped the cylinder head around, essentially making it so that instead of exiting on the offside, the exhaust exited on the near side, as you can see quite evidently here. This freed up room in the footwell, but most importantly stopped scalding the driver's feet. Originally, in 1926, this car was fitted with 2 superchargers and 2 Zenith carburetors. As they moved the engine over, they couldn't work that anymore, so instead they stuck 1 big supercharger at the front, feeding through 1 Cosette carburetor. Coming along down, have the area where in 26 the mechanic the mechanic's seat would have been. Mechanics themselves weren't required to be seated during the race, but fitment still had to be made. 27, understandably, they got rid of that rule and it became just a single-seater car. Coming on down, see the enormous exhaust pipe, this one not having the Brooklands mandated silencer, so being more typical of what you would see on the continent. And we have, again, the same leaf spring and friction shock absorber setup as round the front. Brooklands was unique at this time, as in all cars at Brooklands, regardless of size, had to be fitted with what they call the Brooklands silencer, or the can, as it was sometimes known. Usually just a big, large, baffled silencer on the side to keep the car quiet, or quieter, I should say. Even Grand Prix cars were not exempt from this, and they had to be fitted. This did somewhat impede performance, but it stopped the neighbours of Brooklands complaining at the very loud cars they had beforehand. At the back here, you can see the fuel filler. This tank is enormous. After being sold by Delage, the fuel tank was this entire rear section. Due to limits of fuel tank size back in the Grand Prix season, it wouldn't have been quite this large. The filler caps were flush to aid aerodynamics. Afterwards, however, when sold to privateers, they just stuck a much more conventional fuel filler cap on the top. The reason for this orange circle is because this car runs not only on petrol, but also on benzol and alcohol, which are very dangerous, very, very dangerous. Methanol in particular being invisible when burning. So this orange circle warns anyone nearby that you cannot fill this up with regular fuel, and when you are refueling it, you have to take great care, because methanol is invisible when it burns. You'll feel the heat, but you can't actually see it, and there's no smoke. Not ideal for safety. But they chose that back in the day. One, because petrol quality back then was terrible. Modern estimates put the octane rating of racing fuel back then about 50 to 60, which, well, at a normal pump nowadays you get 95 as the minimum. And also because you can put more fuel into the engine, much more fuel, and therefore generate a much bigger bang, which is obviously what you want when racing. I am now sat inside the Delage 15 S8, and it is surprisingly comfortable in here. You actually have a full bucket seat. Of course, when going around these corners, you do not want to fall out, especially in a day before safety belts. In front of me, I've got this massive wood rim steering wheel, which is actually very precise given the standards of the time. It's not a rack and pinion steering as we would understand today. It's a recirculating ball, but nevertheless, the slop in the middle, by the standards of the time, is actually, it's very, very well controlled. So you're very delicate, so you can precisely line up where you want the car to be. Okay, you can see you have various gauges here. Okay. Only one of which is actually original to the car, and that is this gigantic tachometer in the middle, rev counter. Okay, you see, it goes all the way up to 9,000 RPM. That was this car's party trick. This engine running on 62 roller bearings and ball bearings, okay, could achieve a speed that was simply unheard of by the standards of the time. Made about 180 horsepower in racing form at about 7,500 to 8,000 RPM, right where this orange section is, indicating when the driver should change gear. Okay, right over here at the far side you have coolant temperature, and you have vacuum and boost pressures for the supercharger. Here, a regular air pressure gauge. Okay. And then here you have a fuel gauge. Obviously, quite important to keep an eye on when racing. Originally, this car would have been fitted with a 5-speed gearbox, which was really very impressive by the standards of the day. cars into the, well, racing cars at least, into the 50s wouldn't have 5-speed gearboxes as standard fitment. But yeah, it had 5 speeds, one of which was an overdrive to ease when going on longer routes. Very useful at Brooklands, actually, where there were very long straights. Okay, and everything else was mechanical. So you had a very, very heavy clutch pedal, which was also rather vague. That was a complaint a lot of the drivers had. Very vague, but had decent brakes, as it had a servo system, very similar to a modern car, running off of the gearbox though. So right by where I'm sat would have been the gearbox. Unfortunately, this car is somewhat gutted. It's awaiting restoration. And then you had your accelerator all in the normal places. Here as well, you also have a fuel cutoff. This has been modified to suit modern safety rules when vintage car racing, but originally it would have had it to select the main fuel tank at the back, as well as the reserve fuel tank buried just under here, which has since been removed. Starting this car, as I'm sure you can imagine, is not an easy process. It is a two-man job. You need one man at the front of this enormous bonnet, turning the starting handle, whilst the driver, on the other hand, turns and pushes this. This injects fuel directly into the engine. You have a priming pump here to prime the fuel tanks, get the carburetor full of fuel, and then turn it round. Hopefully the engine fires. Yeah, you're waiting for the oil, for the coolant to get itself warmed up, get itself mixed around. Because after all, it's quite a challenge in the 20s. Well, it's a challenge nowadays to make an engine rev this high. Remember, this car is 99 years old this year. You know, this was a day and age where your standard Austin 7 would rev max, its red line was 2,400 RPM, which is, well, by modern standards, abysmal. Our lorry engine. So 9,000 RPM, 1926 was simply unheard of, and it really shows the ingenuity and the engineering quality that Delage and its chief engineer at the time, Albert Lorry, were putting into these truly exquisite cars. Like, for example, you also have little detailing here. Machine turned dashboard here. Just about make it out. It is obviously rather worn. There's no reason to do that other than it looks nice. And that is what Delage were all about. This car, it may not have been in a wind tunnel, so they made it look as aerodynamic as they could, but Lorry was told, I want something that looks strong, fast and stable, which this certainly does. You put it alongside a 1926 Bentley or even a Bugatti, and it looks like it comes from a different decade. It's so advanced, so low. Well, is it any wonder why, in this form, in 1927, they won every single Grand Prix they entered, to the point that even Bugatti simply got fed up. They didn't want to join in anymore because Delage were that dominant. The engine itself is unbelievably complicated. 62 ball and roller bearings involved in its construction, which is frankly absurd. The tolerances and the machining quality on all of these parts would have been minute, especially in a day and age where especially metallurgy, but particularly machining, weren't exactly good. Bear in mind, long before computer-controlled machining or billeting, as it's known today. Speaking of which, the crankshaft was machined from one single block of metal. Unlike, say, today, where they're forged using very, very strong presses, or whether they're cast, this one, machined on a gigantic lathe, cut exactly to shape. something that even today is incredibly complicated and difficult and requires a lot of experience. The engine itself is a 1.5 litre straight 8 dual overhead cams of a monoblock construction, so it has no separate cylinder head. This is very good in the fact that you don't have to worry about head gaskets, for instance, but if you ever need to do any rebuilding of this engine, you have to do everything from underneath, which is not exactly convenient for the pit crews, shall we say. The entire outside of the engine as well, along with the gearbox, were engine turned for the same reason as the dashboard. No practical reason, it just looks nice. And it, again, shows the level of artistry, really, involved at Delage, or really the whole premier French car industry. Hotchkiss, Delage, Bugatti in particular, obviously, being the only surviving name of that time. The supercharger runs at about 1/4 bar, not particularly high, but its primary purpose was to make the engine more tractable, especially at lower RPMs. This engine, being so small and revving so high, is a real screamer. Most of its power is produced up high, but for those slower corners, you need some tractability at low speed. That's the primary purpose of the supercharger. As I said, about 1/4 bar, and it feeds into a single intake manifold, so all that air and fuel is travelling through one single throttle, and it has a blow-off valve integrated into it, as backfires and misfires were very common, and front fires were also common. So a blow-off valve was integrated into the intake manifold so that all that excess pressure can be released without damaging the supercharger or the carburetor. The carburetor, of a very conventional design, manufactured by Cosette, and it did seem to have some manufacturing problems, as this engine very quickly, especially in 26, developed a reputation for misfiring, which in 1926 only made the burning feet problem worse. So drivers were expected, when they got into the pits, as many as 4 times in 6 laps at the British Grand Prix, they would be expected to hop out, dunk their feet in water, and then immediately get back in and back on. Whilst to outside observers, including Henry Seagrave of the Talbot team racing against them, he said, to all intents and purposes, the Delage team and the pits were always on fire. There were always problems, the engines backfired so much, the noise, the smell, you can't imagine what it must have been like, whilst having your feet roasted and whilst breathing in, let's just say, not exactly healthy fumes, as the exhaust pipe was too short. With that, thank you very much for watching. You can, of course, see this car here at the Brooklands Museum in the Jackson Shed, our history and evolution of the British Grand Prix, which is appropriate, given this car won the first British Grand Prix. We will also be having it throughout all of next year, as it is the 100th anniversary of the British Grand Prix. So you may very well see more of this. We very much hope you visit, and yes, thank you very much for watching.